have this morning. You've all met Susie, so she did the report this morning, and she's going to stay up here and help us with some of the additional questions we have. And once I've gone through 2 or 3 opening questions that we've developed, we're going to ask you for questions. They can be, by the way, your questions can be general office-related market questions, as well as questions related to the study that was presented this morning. So if you just know of a project you want to ask about, or a potential employer moving to town or something like that, that'd be fine to ask that question at that time as well. So our speakers this morning, starting to my right and your left, Dave Montijo. Dave's the first vice president with CBRE. He's been in the commercial real estate brokerage business for 29 years, specializing in office-related properties and land. He's a founding partner years ago of Bourne Partners. He has significant experience with all types and phases of office product development, from site acquisition through delivery and lease-up. He has been involved in the sale, leasing, and development of over 6 million square feet of office and medical office in the Tucson area. Or I'm sorry, in Arizona, broaden that a little bit. Dave's non-professional affiliations are with the Centurions, March of Dimes, Tucson Country Club, and with Special Olympics. He's a U of A grad in finance and has a law degree from the U of A. Learn something new every day. Mark Irvin, to my right, most of you know. Mark is the principal behind Mark Irvin Commercial Real Estate Services. He's been active as a broker in commercial real estate in Tucson for over 30 years. He did start right after junior high. He has earned his CCIM and SIOR designations and is the only local office broker to have both of those designations. Outside of brokering real estate, Mark's involved in the community as a vice chair and secretary of Rio Nuevo Board. He's had lead positions on numerous CRE transactions related to Rio Nuevo, most notably the hotel transactions downtown. And he also was involved in the Hexagon mining save that we had mentioned earlier in today's presentation. And to my left and your right, joining us from Axia Real Estate Appraisers is Kent Ahrens. Kent began his commercial real estate career in Taiwan and China. You might want to take that up with him after we speak today. I'm sure there's some interesting stories there. In 1999, he joined Axia here in Tucson and began his real estate appraisal career. He has his MAI designation. He's a graduate at the U of A in business administration. He also has a Master's of Science degree from Georgia Tech in urban and regional planning. Thank you all for joining us today. And so with that, we're going to just delve into a few select points that came out of the study today, just to highlight some things and get insights from other people's perspective. The first question that was developed is this. Susie mentioned the fact that some of the pushback she got on downtown employment, downtown locations for businesses had to do with one-way streets and parking, pressures on parking and paying for parking. So my question is, to each of the panelists, is do you see those, and what other pushbacks from downtown as being a desirable place, or at least perceived pushbacks from folks that should be considering a downtown environment? Dave, I'll start with you.
Make sure the thing's on. Can everybody hear me? Oh, I guess you can. I think that concept is an older concept. I think Caterpillar has changed that concept. We call it the Caterpillar effect. One of the major things that those folks wanted when they looked at sites was basically a downtown urban development for their employees. The younger generation likes that walking, be able to go to lunch different places, and so I think that's changed. And I think the one-way streets, with that, from a negative side of things, it has a cost differentiation between being downtown, east side, northwest, so it's a cost alternative. So I think it's lessened over time. I think as downtown continues to develop some rooftops, I think you'll see that effect be less and less as we move forward.
Go ahead, Mark.
Dave, I concur on that's kind of an antiquated deal, and maybe how some Tucsonians would look at downtown. You know, I think until the table was set with a lot of the things that occurred, there really wasn't a lot of opportunities or reasons for people to go downtown. I mean, if you look at people, why they weren't downtown, why would you go downtown? So I think that is an antiquated view. I can tell you with both Caterpillar and Hexagon, they wanted to be in an urban environment. And in both of those instances, our competition was Denver, Colorado. They've got a mining school. I could go on until I'm blue in the face. They selected Tucson for a whole multitude of reasons. And I think that has really changed. They wanted to be in a downtown environment. You know, when they first started looking at Tucson, Caterpillar, they were looking way out in the hinterlands. And, you know, I think because of collaboration, so Susan, I'm sorry, I would disagree with you on the collaboration thing wholeheartedly. And we can talk about that later. But we're seeing, you know, people like Caterpillar want to be in a downtown environment. The other thing that I might mention about Caterpillar is that building is not 200,000 feet. That building is 150,000 feet.
Depends on what type of work you do. For example, everyone here is involved in real estate. So if you, during the day, you have to go out and see properties, go around the community, it's not just about the commute, then being downtown is a problem. You know, as an appraiser, I have to go see properties, brokers, the same. If you're not specifically working in downtown, these types of people and others don't want to be there because it is a hassle trying to, in addition to commuting, during the day, leaving and coming back. That's problematic. It's a waste of time. So it depends on the type of office user. I do think that there is still a perception of, I grew up in Tucson, and I remember as a kid, listening to people and talking, when adults knew that they had to go downtown for some reason, there was concern. There was concern, am I going to be able to park? There's uncertainty about availability of parking, where you're going to park, are you going to find a spot? In fact, people at that time, just the thought of parking in a garage was scary. So there is still some of that. You know, that doesn't go away, you know, in a decade. That takes time. So those are factors.
If you could pass the mic along.
I agree, it is an antiquated idea. I personally am not too worried about it. I think I'm not a millennial, but a lot of the millennials right behind me aren't too worried about it. And I will say that the people who brought up the issues with parking in one-way streets are perhaps some of our more seasoned market participants. It is an idea that's going away. What I would love to see is the numbers behind that. Once we're no longer 20% vacancy in our multi-tenant buildings downtown, that would suggest that it's not a concern anymore.
The 20% number, as far as vacancy, isn't there an element of how can we call that number to drive it back to a number that represents really viable leasable space and takes out space that just nobody's ever going to lease again? It's still on the rolls, but no one's ever going to spend the money to renovate it, and we need to kind of drop it from the inventory somehow.
Well, it's vacant space within larger buildings. So all that space, the 20% that I'm throwing out there, is all space within 100,000 square foot buildings. So short of demoing a building, which I think is on no one's mind, we need to figure out how to revamp
So
that
those
space
aren't
and
necessarily
make it usable.
standalone smaller properties.
Those are not standalone smaller properties. Those are all the
Inside.
100,000 square foot plus multi-tenant buildings in downtown, not including government.
All right, thank you. The next question that we have is related to North Tucson and Oro Valley. It talks about the fact that since about 2016, last 2 to 3 years anyway, the construction deliveries in the Oro Valley, North Tucson market are about 81,000 square feet, which represents 50% of the new supply in the Tucson metro area. And so the question that's been raised is, you know, how many, going forward, looking forward, I guess you could talk millennials, but Mark was just talking about how Caterpillar wanted to be downtown and wanted to have access to downtown facilities. If this is the kind of development that's happening in a more suburban market, what do you see as the appetite in the Tucson area for the Oro Valley type setting versus downtown? Are younger companies going to be looking for that, or is it the hustle and bustle of the downtown?
I'll save David and go first this time. You know, it's interesting. 10 years ago, there was not a market in Moran or Oro Valley. We didn't even have a submarket area. So the reason there's a submarket area is because, you know, retail, rooftops, all that kind of stuff follows. And so we've seen, you know, a lot of product that's been built in that area because there's been available land, and there's been developments that were set up as garden-style office parks that were really easy for people to step in and develop things. Do I think that'll continue? I think it's slowed down a little bit, The medical stuff is clustering around hospitals. All the other stuff is really clustering in, garden-style type parks. I think that market will continue to grow, but I think we've seen that big spur of growth because there just wasn't any product up there 10 years ago.
And when we talk about the major developments up there, we're talking about two major hospital developments. One by Northwest Hospital up in Thornydale, about a 70,000-foot medical building. You're not going to locate that development elsewhere. It's got to be next door, walking distance. You also have the surgery center by Northwest Hospital, Orange Grove and La Cholla. Again, on the campus, surgeons doing their business there. So those are site-specific. You eliminate those numbers from the market, it's pretty much equal around all markets. So there's a kind of a specific site requirements for those users.
I see that trend of expansion to the northwest continuing, especially Marana, as being on the northwest side provides you access to Phoenix. Phoenix is where jobs are. It's where business is and activity. So if you live on the northwest side, you can actually commute to Phoenix. So I see the I-10 corridor just continuing to strengthen going forward.
Susie, anything in particular, downtown versus suburban? Ken?
One thing that I want to mention is, again, I keep referring to my market participant interviews because that's my job as an appraiser. I gather data, I analyze, I report. And there are some conflicting opinions about it. One opinion that I did get is that the decision makers live up in Oro Valley. That's where a lot of our higher up employees, if you will, live. So River and Campbell has been suggested as kind of the hot spot area to be, and then up and north of that. Again, is that a generational issue that we don't want to be downtown? I don't know, and maybe that'll change in the future, but it seems to be pretty hot up there for the decision makers of the company.
So there are definitely some that migrate towards the downtown environment, want to be near the courthouses, things like that, and then others where downtown is more of a liability, and maybe they want more open space or better views or whatever the case might be. The next question that's been raised has to do with shovel-ready sites and the pros and cons of shovel-ready sites. There are representations made by other parties, not by Susie, but as part of the study that shovel-ready sites could be developed in as quickly as 6 to 9 months. If you purchase it and you have a plan in your hand, you could be in the building in less than a year. This potential quick turnaround is offset by the limitations the shovel-ready site has. It's already got some type of footprint potentially set on it, the size of the building, the square footage, the parking, things that might be overly restrictive to somebody coming in wanting to do what they want to do at that site. So the two questions really are shovel-ready sites, pro and con. I mean, what do you see as far as new people coming to the market that like that concept and are willing to go with it? And the other one is turnaround time. Is there really a big benefit to shovel-ready sites as far as getting someone in a building, or is it really truly more of a 1 to 2 year process and not a 6 to 9 month process the way it's been represented here?
Personally, I think 6 to 9 months is a really generous estimate. Maybe that's just construction time, but you got to think of everything that goes before that as far as planning and development. And those shovel-ready sites really cater to the smaller owner-user. So when we're talking about shovel-ready sites within corporate centers, we're usually dealing with a 5,000 square foot owner-user who wants to come in and have their own space. Case in point is Caterpillar. Shovel-ready didn't work for Caterpillar. They needed a bigger space. They wanted to be in a different area. So again, it depends on the user. I think a 15 to 18 month estimated time is probably a little bit better for smaller projects and more than that for larger.
On this topic, I'll defer to Mark and David. I think they have a lot more to contribute.
We don't really have a lot of shovel-ready sites in Tucson, so I'd say it's definitely a con. I mean, the ones that are there probably are not in places that a traditional office user would want to go. Caterpillar is a great example. Susie, you're dead on with that. That is not a site that was ready to go. We've just gotten finished, Rio Nuevo has just got finished taking that site. We hauled 15,000 truckloads of stuff from the old dump off that site to the Los Reales landfill and hauled back in 15,000 loads of clean fill. I'm happy to tell you that site is now ready to go. We'll actually, now that the site's ready to go, we've spent the last, God knows how many months doing that, we'll start construction. That building will not be ready for Caterpillar to move in until March of 19. That's what our agreement with them says. So that's 3 stories, 150,000 square feet. That's the deal with that one. But there's just not a lot of sites here. And I guess the other thing that I would say on how long does stuff take, you know, it really depends. Do you have a garden-style office building with, you know, the developers already knows what the footprint's going to look like, and it's really just what's going to happen inside? That's a heck of a lot quicker than trying to design a 150,000 square foot building from scratch.
I actually don't have much more to add than that, and I think Mark's correct. It becomes, and Susie's comment, it depends on the user. Someone as large as 150,000, 200,000 foot, that so-called shadow building, shovel-ready, is really needs to be planned out years in advance with the user. They've got to commit to the site. They've got to go through lease negotiations, corporate approvals. It just doesn't happen in 6 to 9 months. And that may be a 15 to 20,000 square foot building such as Tucson Orthopedic Innovation Park. That's going to be up and ready in 9 months from closing. It's a small build-to-suit type scenario. These larger corporate offices take easily 18, sometimes north of 2 years, just through the corporate approval process before you put shovel to the ground.
Jumping ahead to demographics and kind of some interpretations on the demographic numbers that Susie brought to our attention. Tucson doesn't follow the norms as far as increased jobs bring increased people, and that, I believe, probably has something to do with our population mix as far as folks over 65 who aren't working anymore. Some of them are under 65 and aren't working anymore. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about, or have the panelists talk a little bit about what they see as being the drivers for, or the tie between growth in population and market demand for office space, and what beyond the retirees might influence that lack of correlation that we have in our market.
I think Susie's slides kind of said it. You have employers basically having their employees in less space. Many times the amount of work that employees have to do has increased. So if you lose one person, that job sometimes is split among 2 people. So they're not hiring, they're not replacing that employee. I think technology has made a huge difference in how people work and how much volume is expected of them. So I think continually the office space is shrinking to a point where it's hard to fulfill that job. That's where the younger employees now want life-work balance. They want certain things involved in their office space. So that's constantly going to be changing, depends on who you're hiring for your workforce. And I think at a certain point in time, you know, you hear the complaints about the call centers where these guys were in 4x5 type cubes jammed in together, and as the increase of competition for those employees, the spaces have gotten better. The benefits to the employees have gotten better, so they're jumping from place to place for a better job. And that costs that old company substantially more dollars than it does if they had a better work environment. So that's constantly going to be an ebb and flow on who's got the power in terms of who needs who, the employee or the employer.
Well said. And I also think Susie's graph was really on target with stuff. But the only 2 things that I would add to that is, I think after the Great Recession, which our community went into way before anybody else did, and then we just enjoyed it so much, we kind of hung around and you know, played with it for a while. And we're still, we're still dabbling in it. So I think during that process, what I saw is I saw a lot of the people that we work with that learned how to do more with less. And that means less space, less this, less everything. And I think they're slow to ramp up because we're not still quite out of things yet. The other thing that I might point out is there's options that are now in the market that weren't here a number of years ago. I mean, yeah, everybody's always had executive suite space, but the millennials don't want that. They want to have collaborative space. So if you look at some of the collaborative opportunities that are going on downtown that have been created by Scott Steitler and the guys over at Alualoa with, you know, they're building the Pioneer, there's just options that are available that weren't available before. So I don't think that's going to change.
I think a lot of it may have to do with the economic base of the community. In Tucson, you have a higher proportion of governmental and nonprofits as compared with Phoenix, where you have a distinct corporate culture, which we kind of had in the 70s and 80s, which went away. That ties into speculative development and multi-tenant development, as opposed to Tucson, where it's nonprofits, governmental, private doctors and business owners they have very different office needs, and you have it's a different basis for office employment.
Next question ties to Susie's conclusion, and she touched on it. I guess I want to get the same insights that she shared from the other panelists, but how do we go from $22 rents to $30 rents that make new growth possible, viable, beyond the owner-users that are building their own properties today? And she summarized it, I'm going to try to paraphrase, as being, you know, we take our singles and we take our doubles along the way over the next 5 or 7 years or whatever it is, and eventually existing inventory gets older. It becomes even less desirable or less cost-effective to build. It gets chopped up into more pieces and larger users can't use it, and ultimately we simply need larger plates available for Class A users. So I guess the question I want to summarize with for the panelists is, how do we get from $22 to $30? Is it big wins? Do we draw some people in that we haven't seen in the past? Or do we just keep hitting singles and doubles and growing incrementally?
I don't think the gap is that large. You know, when Dave and I were talking about this earlier, when we look to gross up leases from a triple net to a, you know, full service equivalent, I think your gross up number is a little bit light. I actually think we're about $1.50 to $2 closer to that number than is really talked about. Also, if you look at some of the numbers, and you know, Dave and I were talking about this, like the Foothills average rate, $22. David, when's the last time you did a $22 foot deal in the Foothills? Pre-recession. Yeah, it's just kind of some dated, I think, data. So I don't think the gap is quite as big as it people think it is. I do think Tucson has a great number of opportunities for demolition. We got some really functionally obsolete buildings in this town, so I know I hear that from time to time with people that are coming into town. We do struggle with bigger footprints. There's not a lot of big footprint buildings in town, so if you look at like the Hexagon building, if you look at some of the RFP stuff that we just issued, if you look at the Caterpillar building, those are all big footprints, okay? Those are not your traditional, you know, 5151, you know, 13,000 and some change footprint. It's just not that number anymore.
The other consideration is, you know, our biggest problem is multi-tenant. As office brokers, we look at things as multi-tenant. What's our vacancy level? So you've seen lately, in about the last 3 or 4 years, you've seen a lot of buildings from the 70s and 80s get repurposed. They're set around vacant, can't be leased. A lot of them were bought by the behavioral health groups in town, renovated, and got those off the rolls as owner users. And that's going to continue to happen as some of our local companies get larger and they start buying some other buildings. We've got probably 3 or 4 in our office that are being repurposed, and that'll be eventually will happen. Most owners that own B buildings are either they're not full enough to refinance or sell as an investment, and they're not empty enough to revitalize. They're kind of caught in a quandary, but they're still getting cash flow because a lot of those guys bought those things through the RTC, those of us who are old enough to remember those days. So you're going to see more and more over time some repurposing. Demolition is a tough nut for someone to swallow and redo. The other biggest problem is multi-tenant. As the chart showed, most of the things were done as a build-to-suit. If you look at the history, Pima Savings on Broadway became Sunquest's new headquarters. Sunquest then finally needed a new building. That became 250 South Williams. MDA moves out. Sunquest downsizes, moves the MDA. Someone backfilled the 250 South. Unfortunately, I cannot talk about that. Those who already know the market, that's how our market's done, these big areas. You do build-to-suits, and those get reverted as companies come and go. And until we have enough larger floor plate users to say, hey, I want to build a building, you want to come here, hold tight. I got to get a few more, because guess what? The financing for those projects require a lot of pre-leasing. And Tucson historically has not been a pre-leasing town. And let alone trying to keep the dominoes in place while you try to gather your troops to make this a viable deal. In Phoenix, Scottsdale, those are Class A markets. They will give you the money to build a building because they have a historical track record of companies constantly backfilling these spaces and new spaces. So we don't have that resume in Tucson, Arizona. So multi-tenant is going to be a long way coming.
For us, as being involved in real estate, we often think about specific projects and the aspects of the projects themselves, when I think demand for office is really organic. you can't just focus on the project. This is thinking as a community. We can't just focus on individual projects. We have to think about what are the attributes of the community that may or may not make it attractive to be here. If the roads look like crap, the infrastructure looks like crap, the schools aren't good, you're not going to draw people, and you're not going to have multi-tenant development. It's going to continue to be the private, individual proprietors, nonprofits, governmental. So it requires a community change.
The medical multi-tenant is a different market. The health world has changed since Obamacare. So you have most all your primary care, your family services, your pediatricians have all gotten larger. Their reimbursements for patients is less, so what they do is cut down on operating expenses, which means less full-time employees, less accounting, less back office requirements for each physician, so they're getting to larger spaces. A lot of the vacancy in medical was 1970s, 1980s, single doc locations, maybe 2 docs. Those are still obsolete. So what you have is when you have at St. Joe's, 65, 67 being built, the new buildings at St. Mary's, the new buildings by Northwest Hospital, that's pent-up demand, which does not exist in general office, but definitely exists in healthcare. They need bigger floor plates. They need bigger clinics. Yes, it costs more to build, but they're willing to pay those costs because a lot of these companies are nationally or state or hospital affiliated, and therefore they're looking at costs from a national basis, not just from one part of Tucson to another. So the multi-tenant medical will continue to be healthy as these hospitals that reinvent themselves along with the medical groups.
Recently, I become involved with Sun Corridor, which was one of the groups that was put on the board here as one of the groups that's participating in trying to retain and attract employers to the community. And the one comment I would make kind of from my perspective as a lender as well as a member of the community is there is no employment nirvana for these companies. I mean, it's a low cost of living to move here, and our schools could be better, but our real estate prices are low for housing. If they want really great schools that are top of the nation everywhere you go, every part of town, their employees are going to pay twice as much for a house. So it is not that we are always behind the 8 ball. We have things to offer certain employers that want what we have to offer. And obviously, we all know that schools, for example, are selectively much better in Tucson. It's not across the board. It's just an image and a reputation that we have to try to overcome. The last pre-prepared question I have today is not from the report. One of our board members brought this to my attention and just wanted me to float it with the panelists today, and I have. And I know we have at least one panelist that can respond to it, so I'm going to go ahead and raise it. The City of Tucson has issued an RFP for a site located, I believe the best way to phrase it would be across the street from TEP, between Scott and 6th on Broadway. And I just wanted to know if anybody in the panel knew more about that RFP and or its status.
Well, first off, we should put aside something. That's not a City of Tucson RFP. If you really want to piss off Pima County, call it a City of Tucson RFP.
That's my error, by the way,
Okay.
folks. That's
so
me.
So whatever it's worth, that is a Rio Nuevo. Those are 2 lots that the county owns, that the county has worked with Rio Nuevo to reposition those. We're taking the lead on those. That's an active procurement that's going on. The procurement is closed now, and that process is continuing. I really can't comment a whole lot about that since that's an active procurement, but I can tell you that if you read that procurement, there were certain things that were important, like a certain amount of retail, a certain amount of parking, and a certain amount of office space. And the number of 5,000 parking spaces comes to mind. At least 10,000 square feet of retail comes to mind. And at least, 500. And then at least 150, I wish 5,000, sorry. Thank you, David. My zeros are out of place. And then 150,000 square feet of office. So that's an active procurement that's going on, and our hope is that we'll make some announcements way in advance at the end of the year.
Mark probably has a similar opinion as mine regarding the comment on collaboration, because in my experience, we've never worked as a region better, jurisdictions, public sector, private sector. So I'd like to hear Mark's perspective as a Rio Nuevo board member.
I think it's a great question, and I concur with you. I think it's at an absolute all-time high, and I think if we look back on people wanting credit and this, that, and the other. The Caterpillar deal is an example. You know, Rio Nuevo, Sun Corridor, Arizona Commerce Authority, you know, Pima County helped by providing temporary office space. The city of Tucson helped us with a whole pile of stuff. I could go on until I'm blue in the face. And, you know, I think what I was most impressed about in that transaction was that regardless how that thing started, it seemed like people knew when was a good time to drive and when was a good time to sit in the back seat. I think it was a really good reflection of what we can do in this community. I don't think 5 years ago we would have been able to achieve any of those things. And I think hopefully, and by the way, I'm going to give a lot of credit to my pal Fletcher McCusker, I think through Rio Nuevo we've kind of helped show how people can work better together. So I think if you look kind of what I think our legacy will probably be helping get people to the table and not taking credit. You know, the Rio Nuevo deal, I mean, who drove that bus? I mean, Amber, I think you know the size of that deal. And, you know, Rio Nuevo threw in the land, we made the land ready, I could go on, and then we're building them basically about a $50 million building on that site. So a lot of things involved in that. Obviously, Rio Nuevo took the lead on that, but it wouldn't have been possible without the great folks at Sun Corridor and the city, and I could go on. It was not one single, I mean, obviously at the end, somebody had to step up and put all the paperwork together, which was Rio Nuevo, because it's our deal that we're building and leasing them back the building. But none of that would have been possible without all the jurisdictions, including the state of Arizona, stepping in and saying, hey, this is important, let's figure this thing out. So for whatever it's worth, people that think there's not high collaboration going on, you are absolutely, totally incorrect. There's probably not a week that goes by where I'm not in a handful of meetings with the mayor, the city manager, various council people, people with the county, with Huckleberry. I could go on. Very, very high degree of collaboration, and including all the folks at Sun Corridor. Whoever thinks that's not happening, that's incorrect.
If you were to take out B and C office space in the downtown, what would that 20% vacancy rate drop to?
That's a good question, and I would have to run the numbers. I don't know off the top of my head. The problem with statistics is you can slice them 800 ways, and I didn't have 4 hours. So it's an interesting question, but just for clarification, that number does not include government buildings. I scrapped Pima County buildings on that. That's just multi-tenant investment. So it's an interesting question, though.
If an office investor is coming to you today and saying, okay, I want to buy a office building in Tucson, Arizona, it would appear that 15 years ago, some of the rents in Williams Center and La Paloma were about what they are today. If expenses are higher, rents are the same, potential occupancy could be less. Or would you suggest to somebody that they should pay less today than they would have 15 years ago?
Trying to wrap my head around that question. I think Mark is too. I mean, I think you have to take the snapshot of today. What's your NOI? It doesn't matter what it was 10 years ago. What you can look historically is going to look at what's our occupancy and vacancy rates. Have you retained tenants? Have they been there a long time? Has the landlord invested in the common areas, redone the bathrooms, redone the hallways, whatever the case may be, to bring that building up, as opposed to just letting it sit and be tired and old. So you're right, operating expenses, Susie, I'm sorry, you're going to hit me later in the office. In a full-service building, they run anywhere from $10 to $11.50. That depending on your actual building. Those are the expenses of a multi-tenant, multi-story office building. So you're correct. Before they were 8, 9. So what you're going to have is a lower NOI. The strength of the rent schedule and your rent tenants will determine your cap rate, how long the leases are for. So I really can't say the difference between what it was 10 years ago and what it is today, because it's always this market snapshot when you're ready to write the check.
Well said. The only thing I might add to that is I think it really depends on geographic area. So let's just take the foothills as an example, Jerry. You know, where are you going to go build an office building up there? They're not. I mean, there's one parcel there, you know what it is, and you can't really build on it. So, you know, I think some of those things trend based upon just what's available. I think every investor looks at stuff a little bit differently. Some are, you know, totally dialed into a cap rate. Others are like, hey, I'll pay a cap rate, but I don't want it X% above reconstruction costs, et cetera. So I think people look at what's happening today. If I look back at, my historical database from 1986, I don't think it has a lot of relevance to what's going on today. And the other thing, and I might just, while I'm just kind of on a little soapbox for a second, this is a office market roundtable. What I would call this is an office building roundtable. David touched on this, but the office guys look at things very differently. Some of the buildings that are included, I think it's great that the courthouse is going in downtown. Doesn't impact anything that we do, guys. I mean, yeah, does it bring some more bodies downtown? Yeah, it does, but it doesn't really impact the office market. I think some of the geographic areas that are looking at now, and some of the types and classes of buildings really are not relevant today. I mean, so I just think, the way that we have traditionally looked at the market versus how CoStar looks at the market, I think we ought to get away from calling it a market and calling it a office building really discussion, because a lot of this stuff that we've traditionally talked about is taking a snapshot look back at really what's happening with the multi-tenant office market. Not that the other stuff's not important, but that's a really good indication of market health.
So what are office tenants looking for today? What's the listing if you have it leases?
I think it really depends. We're seeing. I'm going to use Sunquest as an example, probably the best example of all. By the way, I don't have a non-disclosure agreement, so the tenant that replaced them was Raytheon. Okay, so sorry, David, but I'm going to use those guys as a great example. They moved from a building where they had a lot of private offices. They moved from a building that had really high cubicle partitions. And if you walked into their new building at 3300 Sunrise, the old MDA building, you're going to find that when you're sitting down at your table or in your little area, the wall is this high and it's glass, and I can see you, Gary. I know exactly what you're doing. And you can talk to this person, that person. So I think the way people are using space, Kevin, is very different. I think it really depends on who you are. What I'm seeing with most of the stuff, like, Caterpillar's a great example. 50,000-foot floor plates. I mean, there's not that kind of product in Tucson, Arizona. Hexagon, 26,000 square foot floor plates. I mean, we just talked about this. What would you say the biggest was, like a little north of 30? Yeah, 33. I mean, so these are bigger floor plates. So on the corporate side, the people that we're trying to recruit and come to town, they're looking for one thing. The general office tenants in Tucson that are, been here forever, they're all looking for something different.
I concur with that, and I think Susie touched upon it. In certain aspects of our office market law firms, every one of them that's downtown is downsized or right-sized. I think the clients don't want to pay for the opulent offices and the square foot costs at $400 an hour or $500 an hour. So those amenities and image that you had to portray have gone down. The general office tenant who's still 2,500, 3,000 feet, they want a good ownership. They want to maintain the buildings. They want to maintain the common areas. And so I think those landlords that do that and put money back into it end up maintaining what I call protect the rent roll. Tenants don't leave because they've taken care of. It's not always moving across the street for $1 or 50 cents. Usually those tenants are moving because the landlord relationship with them is not as good as it should be.
So if GDP and office vacancy or office occupancy are historically very correlated globally, what's the long-run trend GDP to, say, moving average vacancy here in Tucson? And is the last, say, 6 or 7 years different than the past, say, 40 years? Because I'm trying to figure out, is anything different happening today that didn't happen in the past? Because all these conversations are important, but if the market's still the same as it has always been, we need to figure out how to break path dependency.
I would say, historically looking back, it has to do with the economic base of Tucson. In the 70s and 80s, we actually had a very strong corporate base, and Tucson was considered one of the up-and-coming markets for corporate-type entities. That's no longer the case. As you can see, it's dominated by government, nonprofit, and sole proprietors, doctors, individual users. So I think that's the mindset that we have to keep in mind, that explains, I think, a lot of the change.
Is there any chance that this town will ever get out of the small town mentality and put some money into infrastructure?
The infrastructure of a city tells a lot about the residents and the leaders in the community. Do you respect yourself? If your roads and your infrastructure and your services aren't good, what does that tell everyone about us? We have to keep that in mind. And so the focus should be on core problems, not on the fringe problems that impact a small proportion of the population. It has to be things that involve everyone.
You know, one of our biggest problems is our tax base. It is very narrow. If you look at building owners, property taxes continue to go up. If you own a medical building you built new, now they're taxing your TI component. And so raising our property taxes are significantly higher than other municipalities. And I was told that by much smarter people than I. If you continue to raise rates in one section of the economy, it's very hard to pay for all these infrastructure needs. You need to be able to broaden our base of taxable, whether it's payroll taxes, other incentives. But right now, you're right, it does make an impact. You get off the airport on the Valencia Road, I feel like I'm in a dirt road with full of ruts. But I don't know, that's a much bigger issue for Tucson and its leadership. And you're right, I think we get caught up on small minority vocal neighborhoods, because most politicians, they'll tell you, they get elected, spend the next year working, the rest of the time they're getting reelected. And so I just think somehow we have to come together, both the business leaders and those that are what I call the NIMBYs, and we need to figure out a way not to continue to go on down this path.
The only thing that I might add to that, and it's probably not related to your question, but sort of is, probably the biggest thing that we hear from people that come to Tucson, the single biggest thing that we hear is our education system. You know, and I mean, we just hear it time and time again. And if you look at, let's just take TUSD as an example, since it's our largest school district, shenanigans that are happening there. And if you look, I think I'm right with this. In the last like 15 years, we've had 7 or 8 superintendents. I mean, shame on us. How do we do that? How do we continue to reelect these people that don't seem to get it? So I can tell you with every single group that's come and currently looking at Tucson, that's been their #1 issue is our education system.
David's point is extremely important on the taxes, because as you have more and more government and nonprofits, well, guess what? Nonprofits don't pay taxes. So when a nonprofit buys a building, suddenly that disappears from the tax base, and that burden shifts to everyone else. So taxes keep going up.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to close the meeting.
All right. Again, thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. Thank you to our panelists.